Estimating global inputs of plastic waste into the ocean was listed as one of the top most discussed and shared academic papers for that year. Just last month, she testified before the Senate in the hearing Cleaning Up the Oceans, How to Reduce the Impact of Man-Made Trash on the Environment, Wildlife, and Human Health. Not only is Kara a hardworking, badass scientist, she's a wonderful mother of two beautiful little hellions, which I'll get to see tomorrow. And she somehow manages to put up with my younger brother. So, without further ado, Dr. Kara Lavender.
That is no doubt the best introduction I've ever had. And I'm not sure if those stats are all accurate, but thank you. If they're either way, thank you. So thank you all for coming, whether it's for the giant thing of beer in the back or not. It's great to see a full house. Thanks to Jay, or Uncle Jay, as he's known in our house, for inviting me to come down here. I'm actually here also to go visit Eckerd College tomorrow, so this was kind of an add-on, and I'm just excited that it was able to work out. So I'm going to talk to you today about plastics in the ocean, and for this particular crowd, I'm trying to put some oceanography slant on this because I did start out as a physical oceanographer. How I ended up in plastic garbage is a long story that we can talk about afterwards over a beer, but that's where I've been working for the past 10 years or so. So when I first learned about ocean plastics, the term that was out there, the public perception of the problem was this Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And I'm sure you've all heard about a Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It was, oh, my animation didn't work. That big X was not supposed to be there just yet. But the perception was that there's this giant island of floating trash, twice the size of Texas, more plastic than plankton. We're drowning in our own plastic. And based on the decades of open ocean research, student research at Sea Education Association, many undergraduates and faculty scientists, we knew that the perception was simply not accurate. So I was in the right place at the right time to start working on that as this perception sort of came to a head. But what we knew at SEA going in was that the subtropical ocean, where these quote-unquote garbage patches are located, really looks something like this. And I'm sure many of you have been out, at sea in the subtropical gyres, and it's generally speaking, calm winds. You see ocean and sky and clouds. And on occasion, you may see something float by that's extremely surprising. You don't expect to see a boot or a 5-gallon bucket or a teapot or a toothbrush or some other piece of sort of human trash very, very far from land. It does drift by periodically. More than not, you will see something that you can't quite identify. Maybe these are fishing buoys. Is this some kind of container? Maybe there's a large fragment that looks like plastic. In really rare occasions, you might see some debris that you might be able to trace back to its origin with some certainty. So these are actually items that were observed on board our ship in October of 2012, so about a year and a half after the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. And this was out in the eastern North Pacific Ocean. So we have a floating refrigerator that was drifting by. And when they pulled open this drawer, there's this tray with all kinds of food items with Asian characters on them. Also large debris here, sort of everyday items like this tire, some fishing buoys, a soccer ball, bottles with caps on them, and even a small boat that clearly had been drifting for a long time based on all these barnacles drifted by the hull of our ship. So in this case, you could say with reasonable certainty that these items originated from the Japanese tsunami, but that's quite rare. So actually, the most numerous debris in these regions of the oceans, I'm sure you've heard about, is microplastics. So this is a sort of typical sample of microplastics from a very high concentration sample. So microplastics are generally not readily visible by eye from the deck of the ship. They're too small to see. They're irregularly shaped. There are lots of different colors. You can tell them apart. They definitely look different from sort of the natural biology that you collect in the net. But they are small bits of plastic that are sort of loosely termed microplastic. There's not a really great, consistent definition for that. Even though they're not highly visible, of course, this is still a contaminant in the ocean. But plastics in the marine environment aren't just found floating at the sea surface. So when we think about ocean plastics, that's really a subset of what we think about as marine debris, man-made material that's ending up in the marine environment. And marine debris, trash on the beach, is considered marine debris. So these are a couple of particularly shocking photos. One from Lima, Peru, where you see just lots of household trash. This is probably sort of a dump site. And then another photo from a beach in Hong Kong, where if you look at the composition of these materials, a lot of this looks like perhaps it washed ashore from some other place. But when you look at the items most frequently frequently collected in the one-day international global ocean cleanup that the Ocean Conservancy has been conducting for the past 30 years, the top 10 items have not changed over time, and they're things that we all recognize, we all use every day. Hopefully we're not all using cigarette butts every day. That is the number one item. But all these other items are food wrappers and beverage bottles and plastic bags and cans and straws. So a lot of single-use items that are trash that end up on the beach. So these items are all marine debris. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that marine debris is also on the seabed. So this is an image from the harbor in Newport, Rhode Island, which is a very sort of fancy recreational harbor, lots of yachts and sailboats in this harbor. And if you look down at the seafloor right in the harbor, you see plastic bottles and cups and cans and also sort of household trash. But debris on the seabed can also be things like large derelict fishing nets. So this is an image off of Midway Atoll where there's some NOAA divers trying to remove this net that's entangled on the reef. You may be surprised to learn that marine debris is actually in very deep and remote places, really far from land where you might not expect to see it. So this is a plastic bag that was photographed at 2,500 meters depth in Fram Strait in the Arctic. So as I mentioned, marine debris is sort of a larger class of materials. It's not just plastics, man-made materials that can be metal or paper or glass, fibers, cardboard, wood. Most studies that in the open ocean that look at floating debris find almost entirely plastics. I think in my experience sailing, I found a glass bottle once that still had its lid on it. So everything, what's floating is almost entirely plastics. What's found on beach surveys and beach cleanups is mostly plastic, and then plastics are also commonly found on the seafloor. So the most common item, though, when we think about numerically abundant debris of plastics are the microplastics. And the microplastics are found also in a variety of these marine environments. So this is a photo from Camilo Beach on the Big Island of Hawaii with a whole bunch of microplastics easily visible there. They're in the water column, so this is actually a sample from our ship. These were floating at the sea surface. But they've now also been detected in deep sea sediments, so in the North Atlantic, Mediterranean, South Atlantic. These are some fragments of microplastics found very deep in the open ocean. And most recently, microplastics have also been detected in Arctic sea ice. So these are mostly fibers. So what you can see from these images is that the microplastics are small. They are pretty heterogeneous. There's not a sort of easy way to classify them. Most of them are formed from the fragmentation of larger items. There are a few exceptions, like plastic resin beads, which is sort of the raw material of all plastic items, which you can identify pretty clearly. But once larger items are exposed to UV light in the environment, there's chemical degradation, the material weakens, and then as soon as there's some physical force, that fragmentation will occur and the pieces will get smaller and smaller. We don't really know, we don't have a great fragmentation model to understand whether it's sort of a binary fission model or a shedding of particles. So that's an area of active research right now, is how that fragmentation occurs. In general, we have no way to tell what these microplastics started out as, either type of item or where they originated geographically. There really aren't many clues to their origin. So why is plastic debris so widespread in the environment? So this is a figure from a recent paper plotting plastics production in millions of metric tons from pretty much the start of commercial production in 1950 all the way to present. And that's the blue line. And you see that it's a nearly exponential growth in plastics over time. In fact, over that time period since 1950, we have collectively produced 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics. That number is incomprehensible. I can give it to you in Empire State Buildings or elephants or whatever, and they're just all really big numbers. So this is a tremendous amount of material. In fact, the growth in plastics since the 1970s has outpaced the growth of all other bulk materials, things like cement or steel or aluminum. And there's no sign that it's slowing down. So the red line on this figure is plastic waste generation. And this is all global as well. And you see that it's basically the same curve with just a slight offset. So that some of the plastics we use are durable goods, like the furniture we're sitting in, the cars we're driving, the computers we're using. But this is telling you that for the most part, we use plastics and they become waste really quickly. In fact, when we look at what happens to that waste, a very, very small fraction is recycled, about 9%. About 10% has been incinerated globally. And that leaves about 90% of plastics ever made. They're still in existence on this planet somewhere. So they're either in use, but most is either buried in a landfill or somewhere loose in the environment. So in fact, it wasn't long after the start of commercial production that we started seeing plastic debris in the marine environment. This is a photo you won't be able to see very well, but it's from a paper in the late 1960s of a seabird with plastic debris items in its gut. And there are much more, I'll show later another more modern photo of a seabird just like this. But as far as I know, that's the first instance of marine wildlife having ingested plastic debris. It was in the early 1970s that floating microplastics were first identified in the open ocean. Those were scientists out of Woods Hole. In fact, Sea Education Association, SEA, published a paper in Oceanus magazine in the mid-'80s documenting our archive of floating microplastics as well as some beach microplastics in the 1980s. But it really wasn't until Charles Moore published an article in Natural History magazine that this term garbage patch was coined, and this idea of floating islands really grabbed the public's attention. And I think the public's attention was grabbed and the scientists' attention somewhat followed that. The year after, Richard Thompson in the UK wrote a short piece in Science magazine documenting microplastics in water samples. And since then, I would argue that the sort of scientific publication rate has just about followed this curve, especially in the past 5 or 10 years. So it's nearly impossible to keep up with the literature at this point on marine debris. So the amount of plastic in the world is increasing every day. It is not slowing down. There are more and more plastic production plants being built every day, and some portion of that is ending up in the ocean. So one basic question is, how is this plastic getting into the ocean? Of course, if you're solutions-minded, you want to know where the plastic is coming from so you can figure out where to stop it, how to address the problem. So this is just sort of a flow chart that we devised in a working group out of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara. And we start, basically all plastics start out as resin pellets. And if you haven't seen resin pellets, they look something like this, just little spheres, sometimes they're cylinders. And these resin pellets then are sent to converters who turn them into the plastic products that we use, adding chemical additives along the way. The plastic products then are either in use or they've been discarded. If they've been discarded, they may be properly managed, meaning put into a robust waste management system, garbage cans, garbage trucks, landfills, incinerators, et cetera, or they may be improperly managed. And improperly managed waste, really we're thinking about things like open dumping, like those beaches, that beach in Peru that I showed you at the beginning. So that might be one way. If waste is improperly managed, it's in the environment, it could get into the ocean. Another path to the, potentially to the ocean, and these are all sort of the sources into the ocean at the bottom here, I should have said, color-coded by whether we think they are maritime sources, land sources, or both. If you have plastic products that are properly managed, there is one class of materials that, although it's properly managed, might still make its way into the ocean, and that is micro beads that are in wash-off cosmetic products. So this was common practice for quite a long time. The US has now banned these micro beads in cosmetics, but if you imagine that you use your face scrub properly, you rinse your face, the beads go down the drain and they may leak out. They may not be filtered out at the wastewater treatment plant. So these have been detected in the environment. Other sources include products that are in use that are accidentally lost. So a great example of that is fishing and aquaculture gear. There's lots of derelict fishing gear, fishing nets, fishing line, lost traps, as well as things like oyster spacers from aquaculture that end up as debris in the ocean. And then, of course, catastrophic events. And I don't have to tell all of you who live in Florida that this is obviously a major source of debris to the environment as well as human tragedy. So there are other, what we think are probably smaller sources shown on this figure, but at this point, the only source, so the goal of the work, I should say, was to try to put a number, a ballpark figure on each of these boxes to say which is the largest source of plastics to the ocean. And the hypothesis going in was that this lost waste, this improperly managed waste, is probably the biggest source. You may have heard the term that 80% of all plastic waste originates on land. That's one of these statistics that's not really founded in anything that I've been able to determine. But we thought it seems like that may be true, so let's try to put a number on this box. So this is sort of a synthetic science exercise. We're estimating plastic waste input into the ocean, and we're not doing anything with ocean data. So our working group was this multidisciplinary group of about 20, 25 international scientists, including people who are experts in waste management, polymer science, as well as ocean sciences, toxicology, ecology, et cetera. So the way that we tackled the how much plastic is going into the open ocean question was by drawing upon waste management data, originally starting from a report by the World Bank. So the World Bank had collected for countries around the world data on the amount of waste generated per person per day in not every country in the world, but many countries in the world. So we said we're going to look at the 192 countries that have a coastline, start with how much waste is generated per person per day, ask the question how much of that is likely to be plastic, and then how much of that is not properly managed. So that means maybe there's no formal waste management infrastructure and it's just openly dumped into the environment, but that also includes litter, whether intentional or accidental. So we took the total amount of waste generated in each of these countries, narrowed that down to how much was plastic, how much was mismanaged, and then we looked at that total amount of mismanaged waste as the waste that's available to enter the ocean in a given year in 2010. And this was reported geographically because the data started out geographically. But you see there's a pretty clear message from this map. You see that basically the warm colors are the highest numbers, and there's this really large hotspot in Southeast Asia. So first I should say that the total amount of plastic that we estimated to be entering the ocean from waste generated on land is 8 million metric tons. It was actually 4.7 to 12.8 million metric tons in a single year. That last step of saying how much of the waste that's left on land is making its way into the ocean was basically a guesstimate. There are very, very few direct measurements of the flux of plastic from land, whether through rivers or off a beach or carried by wind or storms. So we basically bounded that by some pretty peripheral data. But nonetheless, we're looking for what are the driving factors, where are the hot spots? And so Southeast Asia comes up because there are for two primary reasons. One, there's a tremendously large coastal population in Asia. And I should say this was done assuming we started off with per capita rates, and then we scaled that by the population within a 50-kilometer buffer of each country. So there are large coastal populations in Southeast Asia, and many of these countries are developing economies. So it's well known that as the GDP increases, consumerism increases, and waste generation follows. These countries are also places where robust waste management systems don't exist universally. So it's a combination of producing more waste, lots of people living on the coast, and not being able to deal with it. So most of the top 10 countries were in Southeast Asia. The US, though, isn't off the hook. We were number 20 on the list. And in this particular exercise, in this model, we assumed that we have perfect waste management, which we know is not true. But we assumed that because that's what the data showed in this World Bank report. And we assumed that the only losses were due to littering. But the reason we were number 20 out of 192 is that we also have a large coastal population. And in fact, in the United States, we produce more plastic waste per capita in the coastline than any other country in the world. So we generate a tremendous amount of waste. So even if all of us lose just a straw wrapper here and there, and you add that up, it ends up being a very big number. Okay, so this was just sort of a scale estimate. We're still working on those other sources to say, are any of them even close? We feel at this point from some preliminary work that lost fishing gear is probably a really big number as well. It may not be as big as 8 million metric tons, but we think it's probably close. And natural disasters, we're trying to figure out sort of globally how big that number might be. I would say those are probably the top three. Okay, so why do we care about all this? I'm not a biologist. I'll talk more about my expertise a little bit later, but it's important to remind ourselves that this is a problem for the environment. And why is that? So I just want to talk about some of the impacts and some of the evidence of impacts. We know that many marine animals encounter debris. And I've broken this up into encounters with large plastic debris and then microplastics. So when we think about large plastic debris, we're really thinking about mainly two classes of interactions. One, entanglement, and this is a bird in a balloon string, and then also species transport. So this is we think a child's ball, again, from that Japanese tsunami. You can see there's this blue crab on it and barnacles, all kinds of stuff. In my experience, if you have any sort of piece of debris bigger than about an inch in size, you're going to find something, some sort of crab organism or barnacle growing on it. So obviously, entanglement is a major problem. It's not hard to understand what the impact of entanglement is. In terms of species transport, there was a nice paper out recently documenting the transport of 289 live species from the coast of Japan to North America. which is the largest rafting event that's ever been recorded. And it's unclear whether or not those species will become invasive, will actually threaten the native species. I think there were huge efforts to try to prevent that. But this is one of those types of interactions that could have a negative impact. To date, there have been interactions, and that's a loose term, interaction, but interactions have been documented for more than 800 species with marine debris. Okay, when we think about microplastics, most people are thinking about ingestion. So we do know that more than 200 species now have been documented to have ingested plastic debris. This is a picture of a fish that was actually swimming underneath that 5-gallon bucket that I showed you at the beginning, that both came up in our plankton net. And inside that fish were 42 pieces of microplastic that we could just visually see. But ingestion has been documented for invertebrates, to fish, to shellfish and mammals. I mean, you name it. Basically, anytime somebody decides to study microplastics ingestion in a species, you will find it in some portion of organisms. We'll talk about the impacts of that in a second. One other impact of microplastics, and this is a photo of microplastics, is that pretty quickly after being in the marine environment or over time for microplastics, all of these particles have a biofilm on them. And so this is also another sort of species transport mechanism, but also there's been some work with some colleagues of mine, Linda Emerald-Zettler, Eric Zettler, and Tracy Minster, looking at that community of organisms on the pieces of plastics. And this is an SEM image just showing you some of the diversity of species. And what they found is that that community of organisms living on the plastic is quite different from what's living in seawater and different from what's living on natural substrates. So there is a question about sort of what's happening in this quote-unquote plastosphere. Well, with ingestion, naturally people, I think the biggest public concern is, am I poisoning myself with my seafood? And in fact, yes, anthropogenic debris has been found in seafood. This is a paper from Chelsea Rockman documenting microplastics found in species from a seafood market in Half Moon Bay in California and also from Indonesia. And she found that a portion of nearly all species analyzed, including the fish and the shellfish, had eaten plastic. So does this mean that you and I eat plastic when we eat seafood? The answer to that is possibly and probably, depending on what you're eating. If we're eating fish, we're generally not eating the gut, so anything in the gut we're not eating. But if we're eating shellfish, the chances of ingesting plastics because we're eating the whole animal goes up. The question, though, really is, does it matter? And I will also add that not only are we eating microplastics in our seafood, most likely, but we're also ingesting them in drinking water and bottled water and sea salt and beer. There are lots of different research lines now going out into our plastics exposure outside of seafood. So the question, does it matter if we're eating plastic? And this is where we come to a really important point that contamination does not necessarily lead to impact. So all of these encounters that I've described are just that, encounters. An animal has encountered plastic and may or may not have had a demonstrated impact. So in some cases, it's pretty obvious if there's an impact. This is a California sea lion that had been entangled in one of these packing straps that goes around sort of bait boxes and things. And this particular animal had a happy ending. It was rehabilitated and released back to the wild. But nobody would argue whether or not there was a negative impact on the animal. But where it gets a little bit more complicated is when we think about this ingestion question. So we know that plastics in the marine environment have a suite of chemicals associated with them, some of which were added during manufacture or they're byproducts of manufacture, so things like chemical additives. And others are sorbed contaminants, so contaminants, legacy contaminants like PCBs and DDTs that were already in seawater that are hydrophobic and want to stick to the plastics when it encounters it. So we know that the plastic debris has this variety of chemicals associated with it, but the question is, when animals are eating these plastics, are those chemicals transferring into the animal? Are those chemicals moving up the food chain into our seafood? And that's a really hard question to answer. There's a lot, I would say probably the bulk of work happening in the field is happening on ingestion of microplastics and a lot of chemical questions. And there have been some negative impacts shown in laboratory studies, but you have to remember that in a laboratory study, you're carefully controlling your experiment to test for a certain plastic or a certain chemical in a certain organism. So even if you can show that there is harm in a laboratory study, you can't extrapolate that to what's happening out in the ocean where the exposures are different. We, in fact, don't really know what the animals are exposed to. So I would say at this point, this is a huge question mark and a big thrust of where the science is going. To drive this point home one last time, this is also out of the NC's working group. one of the big questions was, what is the demonstrated evidence in the scientific literature of harm of plastic debris? And so on the left, this is a figure derived from a paper from Chelsea Rockman out of that group. I don't really want to get into the details. This is level of biological organization. So at what level is the impact happening? So here's an organism. This is organs, cells, subcellular things, subatomic particles. I don't know what that means. Populations, assemblages. And then on the bottom is the size of plastic debris from nanometers to kilometers, because the debris does cross this huge size spectrum. And the long and the short was that they did a very thorough critical review of literature through 2013 saying how much evidence is there of harm or of an impact, actually not even of harm, of an impact, positive or negative. And most of this grid is white, and most of the evidence, if there was some, was for sort of bigger debris impacts on the organism. So a lot of this was documenting the negative effects of entanglement. Now, Chelsea's in the midst of updating this with literature to date, and what you can see is that this grid is getting filled out a lot more. There's even more evidence up here on the big debris, but there's starting to be more and more studies looking at the smaller debris and impacts even up at the ecosystem level, effects on populations or assemblages. So again, just trying to reinforce that there is a lot of work going on here. I don't think we can say for sure, broadly what the harm of marine debris is. So when we think about environmental risk, there are really three pieces to this. First, what is the exposure? And so to do this, if an animal doesn't encounter the plastic debris, then it can't be harmed by it. So in order to address exposure, you need to understand the abundance of the debris and the distribution of the plastic debris. Once you have some idea of the encounter rate or the exposure, then you need to know the effect upon exposure, which of course depends on the particle size, the chemical contamination, the type of interaction of that debris. And then after that, you might ask, are there follow-on effects, these questions of trophic transfer or biomagnification of the chemical contamination? So my work has really focused on this piece, what is the exposure? And that's what I'm going to talk about really for the rest of this, although I'm going to leave the animals behind. I'm really just asking, where is the plastic, what is the size distribution, and what is the geographic distribution of the debris? So this is where SEA comes in, and this is how I got brought into this field. Sea Semester is an undergraduate study abroad program. For those who aren't familiar, we have been operating since 1971 out of Woods Hole, and students come to us for a 3-month term. They come and study on our campus for 6 weeks and study the ocean from a variety of perspectives, including marine science, but also maritime history and marine policy. And they learn to be navigators and sailors on board our tall sailing ships. So we have 2 tall sailing oceanographic research vessels, one that operates in the North Atlantic and Caribbean, and the other that operates in the Pacific Ocean. And so Sea Semester students, part of their curriculum is to develop research projects that they carry out on board the ship as sort of the mission of the ship, to do the oceanography research out at sea. And out at sea means open ocean, far from land for the most part. So over time, one of the workhorse pieces of equipment that we deploy is just this basic surface towing plankton net, the Newston net. So you see here a student deploying the net. It's 1 meter wide, 1/2 meter tall, and the mesh is 335 microns. And we tow it at the sea surface, and we tow it to collect data for the student research projects. So including plankton and jellies and all kinds of organisms, as well as debris. Here's another bird's eye view of that net towing off the side of the ship here. I mentioned the stats. We towed for a 1/2 hour to ship speed of 2 knots. And when that containing the cod end jar comes back aboard the ship, this is what our workforce does. Sits in the lab with tweezers and a light and their eyeballs and picks out pieces of plastics from the net. So it's important, we know now from laboratory work that we've done on our archive samples that human eyeballs do a really good job at this size, sort of larger than 1/3 of a millimeter, picking out plastic from biological matter. It's pretty easy to tell size and shape and sort of consistency. Once you get to smaller sizes, you really have to rely on spectroscopic methods to determine whether the particle is plastic. So the students are picking out plastics, they're counting them, and then we scale that by the tow distance, and we report plastic concentration in terms of the number of particles per square kilometer. So this is a map of all of the data collected since 1986. It's actually out of date now, in the western North Atlantic Ocean. So each dot is a single plankton net tow. Here's the US, here's Cuba, Caribbean Sea. And each dot is colored by the measured plastics concentration. So the warm colors are high concentration, The black stars are the highest concentrations of 200,000 pieces per square kilometer or more. And generally speaking, we have seasonally repeating cruise tracks. This was a single cruise track that was a dedicated research expedition in 2010, so that's why it kind of sticks out. So what you'll notice, first of all, is that the black stars, all of the highest measured concentrations were measured really far from land. So we just went through this exercise to say how much all of this plastic waste that's coming off of the continents into the ocean. But in fact, the highest concentrations of these microplastics in the plankton nets are measured far offshore. And in fact, this green star is the highest value we've ever measured in 30-some years of measuring plastics. That was actually 26 million pieces per square kilometer. And this quite literally is in the middle of the Atlantic, sitting over the mid-Atlantic ridge. So actually, the purpose of the research cruise was to say how far across the ocean does this high concentration zone that you can see, these sort of high values, how far across the Atlantic does that extend? The ship had to turn around and come back, but it goes at least halfway across. So we use this to look at the distribution of high plastics concentration, and you can see that concentration in the subtropics, and those in physical oceanography are going to know why. This is where the subtropical convergence zone is. But the other nice thing about this data set is that we could look at this accumulation zone over time because we sampled it repeatedly. So one of the things we did was just look at a really basic time series. So this is just an annual average in sort of a box, not including this cruise track. And we wanted to know if the amount of plastics that we measured was increasing over time, and we expected that it would be. But in fact, there's tremendous variability, and we weren't able to detect a time trend. Since then, we've been reanalyzing the data set, and we've actually extended it through 2017, and we have a paper in review now using a much more sophisticated statistical model, and we think we now can, in fact, detect that increase in plastics. But the reason that it's hard to detect is that there's immense very small scale variability and short-term variability. So even in this cruise track, where we're really in the highest concentration zone, you see the sort of black star next to this blue dot. It just depends on where you are at any point. You can't really predict a particular value. So I mentioned that the accumulation zone is in the subtropical convergence zone, and this is just an animation. I hope I can get my arrow over there. Oh dear. Uh-oh. Oh, those are my kids. We may not get to watch the animation. May not get to see the rest of the presentation. You know, this happened to me once before. Yeah, I wonder what happened there. I think I went to a different, did I go to a different desktop? I don't even. Slide off the screen or just I don't know. I was looking for my arrow, but I don't even have a cursor. Nobody sees an arrow over there, do they? Yeah. Oh, you do? Aha. Yeah. There it is. Okay, that's what happened.
Same desktop 3.
But why is this not? What are you seeing? You're still seeing that. I don't really want that. Let's see what happens, though. Okay, well, here's the movie. We might as well watch that while we're... Okay, so this is a numerical model created by Nikolai Maximenko, University of Hawaii. So it's based on surface data, and it's a statistical model rather than a hydrodynamic model. But basically what he did is he said, all right, let's start the ocean sort of uniformly sprinkled with microplastics and turn the currents on and see what happens. And so what you can see is that the microplastics accumulate as predicted in the subtropical convergence zone. We know that the surface currents are converging in sort of an oceanographic dead end. So one thing that I think was news to a lot of people who aren't physical oceanographers is that here's the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is in the subtropical convergence zone of the North Pacific, but there's also one in the North Atlantic as well as in the Southern Hemisphere oceans. But the model is great from a physics standpoint, but we still had to be able to determine whether there was actually plastic in those parts of the world. Now we have to get the PowerPoint back. Whew. That was lucky. Okay. So that data set I showed you from the North Atlantic from SEA data, what we did in that original paper was we overlaid the plastics concentrations. This is just an average by latitude overlaid on Nikolai's model solution. And you can see there's an extremely good correspondence in the North Atlantic. We also have a data set in the North Pacific that we've collected since 2001, and we sort of played a similar game with that and the models and found also very good correspondence with the numerical model. So going back to sort of the high-level questions, I talked about a little bit earlier, estimating the amount of plastic waste coming into the oceans from land based on garbage data. Data on garbage, not bad data. So then we asked the question, well, what if we go into the ocean and try to use oceanographic data and play that same game and estimate how much plastic there is in the ocean? So this is, again, a paper out of the NC's group, and we started off by extracting from all publications and all data sets we could find all of the plankton net data where plastics concentration had been reported, including where it was reported as a 0. So similar to the last map, each dot here represents a single plankton net tow. The bulk of the data in the North Atlantic are from SEA, and the bulk of the data in this sort of blob in the North and South Pacific are also SEA data. But in this case, we did find there was, over the course of this project, some singular cruises that tried to answer that question. Okay, in the southern hemisphere subtropical gyres, do we also see a similar high concentration of plastics? And the answer is yes, based on 1 or 2 passes through. But you can see in all these gyres that there is an indication of sort of higher concentrations. One thing that I like about this image is it tells you plastics, floating microplastics, are not uniformly spread over the ocean. So here in the SEA data, you see in the tropics very, very low concentrations. And that's, of course, because the equatorial region is a divergence zone. So even if you were to sprinkle plastic trash on the equator, the surface currents are going to carry that away from the equator pretty quickly. So when we go out and sample, we see very little plastic in the tropics. So this was the data set we collected, and we said, well, we can't really just make a big global average because most of the ocean has not been sampled, right? You'd be highly biasing a global average by the places where you've measured it well, which are places that are very high concentrations. So this is where we turn to the numerical models again. So here I'm showing you 3 different numerical models. They're all different formulations. This is that model from Nikolai Maximenko I showed you a minute ago. Here's one from Laurent Le Breton. This is a hydrodynamical model. And then this is one from Eric Van Sebel, which is also based on surface drifter data, but has different formulations from Nikolai's model. So really 3 quasi-independent numerical models, and we use these predictions of plastics or tracer distribution in these physical models together with the observed concentrations to scale the models to get 3 different estimates based on each basin. So I should say we did the regression analysis with the data and the models in each major ocean basin and then added all that up to see what kind of mass of plastics could be accounted for by microplastics in plankton nets. And the answer ranged between 93,000 and 236,000 metric tons. So the range is accounted for by the 3 different models. And if you look at the models, anybody who's in physical oceanography probably is not surprised. They all have subtropical gyres. All the major features are the same, but they're quite different in the details. And in fact, what's interesting to me about the North Atlantic is that actually in none of the models do we really have the same pattern as we see in the data. So in the data, the highest concentrations look like they're maybe sort of centered in the middle of the basin, but none of the models has that kind of distribution. So when you do the scaling with each numerical model, you do end up with quite a large range in terms of the mass of plastics we think are floating based in this size class. Well, now let's put those 2 pieces together, the waste management estimate, the ocean estimate. So from the waste management data, you'll remember the midpoint estimate was 8 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean in a single year. And this image is just to remind you that we're talking about trash. So this is actually from the Los Angeles River. They actually have booms that they put out like you would for an oil spill to collect all the trash that comes down the river when it rains. So this is 8 million metric tons coming in a single year from land. And yet from the plankton net data, we can only account for 1 to 3% of that. So this raises a major question, which is where is all the plastic? You don't expect all of it to be accounted for in floating microplastics, certainly. But the fact is, we really don't know where it is. So this is a very artistic rendering of basically a mass balance model. So we think about the white box as the marine environment. And each of these boxes inside is a marine reservoir. So we've got a coastal reservoir, coastlines on land. sea surface, biota, the water column between the sea surface and the seafloor, the sediments, and sea ice. And there's plastic in all of these compartments. And in fact, plastic is moving between the compartments, and plastic is being transformed within the compartments. But if you just take the highest level of how much we think is going in, how much we think is going out, which is probably a really small number, we can't really put a number on any one of these boxes. We've now, that estimate of 93, the plankton net estimate is just microplastics floating at the sea surface. We're not accounting for large derelict fishing gear or even plastic bottles. Those generally aren't coming up in the plankton nets. So this is a really open question. Where is most of the plastic? Does a lot of it sink to the seafloor where we're not observing it because we don't observe a lot of the seafloor? Is it being transported down? How much is swimming around or flying around in biota? So I want to zoom in a little bit on this idea because I think this is also an area where there's some really interesting research going on. So we're just going to zoom in on this sea surface reservoir for a moment. So I talked about, even if we could put numbers on all those boxes, really that represents sort of a global average snapshot in time, perhaps. We know that there are processes that are transforming the material, that are fluxing in and out of these boxes, and that there's spatial and temporal variability. But let's just look at some examples of the complications in the sea surface. So first, if we think about the sea surface box, these are the inputs. We've got the coastal input. We've got input from ships, whether that's lost rubber duckies over the side or fishing gear or whatever. It's possible that there's airborne deposition where we start with really fine particles. Okay, so we've got the inputs, and then we have the processes occurring within the sea surface box. So I mentioned earlier when talking about the SEA data set, the immense variability in the data set. And a lot of that is due to physical processes like vertical mixing, which I'll talk about in a minute a little bit more, small-scale convergences. So that 26 million pieces per square kilometer green star that I showed you earlier, when they looked over the side of the ship, this was just an intense, almost windrow line of floating plastics that you just couldn't miss, and it was just all over their hands when they brought the net up. Further inquiry, we think that this was some kind of convergence caused by internal waves, because there was no the winds were very light, there were no Langmuir circulations. So there just is physics happening here that explains some of these concentrations. But of the particles that are floating at the sea surface, we know they're being photodegraded by the UV light. We know they're fragmenting, although we don't know exactly how. This is all acting to reduce the size of the particles, so that particle size distribution is changing constantly. I also mentioned earlier, we know that biofilm is forming on these microplastics and on anything out there. I mean, you looked at the bucket covered with stuff and the boat covered with barnacles. So we know that biofilm can cause the density of that material to increase, and there's been some lab work to show that that might actually cause the particles to sink, become dense enough to sink. And then there's also likely aggregation of these particles into bioaggregates happening, whether that's in fecal pellets or getting stuck up in marine snow or sticky phytoplankton. And again, those aggregates may be a mechanism to cause the particles to sink out of the sea surface. So then we think about the fluxes. Fluxes can go between the coastline and the sea surface as trash washes out or washes ashore. There could be fluxes within biota as they eat the plastic and ingest it, and that can transform inside the animal as well, perhaps grinding up the particles, can flux in and out of sea ice, and then some of these processes could cause a vertical flux in the water column, maybe down to the sediments. So it's really a complex story, and I think we're starting to get past, I went out here and I measured some plastic, or I looked in this animal and I saw some plastic. I think we're starting to get into more interesting scientific questions in the field. So I just wanted to end with one of these interesting, for me as a physical oceanographer, scientific questions. So one of my former colleagues, Giora Proskorowski, he was sailing on one of our sea semester trips and had gotten interested in the plastics question, and he was standing over on the railing looking over the side one day, and it was a flat, calm day, and he could see the little bits of microplastics. I told you at the beginning you can't see them. Well, if you know what you're looking for and it's quite calm, you can see these little fragments floating at the sea surface. Many of them are white. So he was looking, and then the wind started to pick up, and he recognized that pretty quickly, even before there were white caps, he wasn't able to see the plastics anymore. So what he did was he just plotted up the measured surface concentration from the net tows as a function of wind speed. And this is by no means a clean plot, and there's 24 values way up here that aren't even plotted, but really what he noticed is that you only get high concentration when there's very low wind. And so this raised questions about the vertical mixing, wind-driven vertical mixing. So we had a colleague down at the Woods Hole Oceanographic named Tobias Kukulka, who was a postdoc at the time, who's a turbulence expert. And so he got interested in the question, and he just built a very simple one-dimensional mixing model and compared the results of that model to the measured plastics concentration. And I should say that we had taken some discrete measurements of plastics concentration at depth using a Mach-Ness-like net. So what you're seeing here is depth on the y-axis and a normalized plastic concentration, so normalized by the surface value. So all the surface values are 1, as a plastic concentration as a function of depth. And so what you see in the observations is a pretty clear decrease with depth, but these are not zeros. And then the models with varying parameters can sort of generally match that shape. What we found was that the models predicted the highest concentrations in the upper 2 meters, and we just didn't have that kind of resolution in our data. But this was a really simple one-dimensional column model. And so Tobias then did some further work with a graduate student named Kelsey Brunner, where they used an LES model and started incorporating things like breaking wave turbulence and turbulence from Langmuir circulations. And again, sort of a messy plot here. This is the surface plastics concentration, measured surface concentration, as a function loosely of, we'll call it wind speed, water friction velocity. And more or less what they showed here is that the models that just had shear-driven turbulence and breaking wave turbulence couldn't account for the distribution in the surface plastic concentrations. You really had to invoke the Langmuir turbulence. So we think that those really deep particles that we saw, and deep meaning like the bottom of the mix layer, 25 meters depth, that these are being mixed down by turbulence driven by Langmuir circulation. So this is an example of using plastics data as a kind of tracer in the ocean. And this leads me to a current effort that I'm involved in through SCORE. We have a working group with the cute name FLOTSAM, Floating Litter and its Oceanic Transport Analysis and Modeling. And the goal of this working group is really to take the physical oceanography and the plastics communities and try to bring them together to understand better the near-surface dynamics that are important to understand the distribution of the floating plastics. So remember, even if it's the animals you ultimately care about, you need to know where the plastic is to be able to determine where they're going to encounter it. So we really want to better understand that based on ocean physics. And the ocean physics, we hope to make recommendations then about gaps that are not currently studied and the observations, improvements in modeling that might help elucidate some of those dynamics. And also, we're trying to assess possible use of remote sensing tools to identify floating plastics. So if anybody's interested in this, we are looking for collaborators, people with expertise who haven't yet been drawn in by the plastics problem. So happy to chat about that. All right, so with that, I just want to wrap up with a few parting thoughts. In case anybody came in with the idea of floating islands, please leave without that idea anymore. Mythical island-like garbage patches don't exist. Plastics contamination, though, is well documented throughout the marine ecosystem and in marine animals. And so it's not everywhere. You're not guaranteed to see plastic wherever you look, but it has been found from equator to poles, from sea surface to sea floor, open ocean to coast. And there are plenty of areas that haven't yet been studied. So I would say we don't really know the distribution all that well, but we know that it is a global contamination at this point. Similarly, the risks of plastic debris are not yet fully quantified. There is no real formal risk assessment for too many of these impacts, but there is evidence of harm at a variety of levels of biological organizations. So this means there is reason for concern and reason to continue studying it. Another open question remains the mass budget of ocean plastics, so that distribution among the marine reservoirs. Again, that's sort of a key piece. You need to know who is encountering the plastic and what it looks like in order to try to get to that impacts question. And then lastly, I hope I've convinced you that plastic debris can also be a useful tracer to study ocean processes. So processes driving small-scale variability, things like wind-driven vertical mixing, and I think probably others. So with that, I just want to acknowledge many co-authors, especially though the core team at SEA, and really the more than 8,000 sea semester students without whom we never would have had this data set, and I don't know what I'd be doing now. But this data set was, nobody knew about it and unless they were a sea semester alum, and then they will remember picking those plastics out of plankton nets. But it really is a unique data set. And then also early collaborators, especially Chris Reddy at WHOI, who sort of recognized the value of this data set and said, you people have to publish this. And then some of the early physical oceanography collaborators as well. And then I just want to acknowledge, since I did refer to the NC's working group a number of times, this is the list of collaborators who, again, span all different fields, marine, non-marine, plastic science, et cetera. So with that, I think I'll end. Thank you.
So I think we have plenty of time for questions.